Welcome to Design+Tech. I think this is our first meeting of 2013, so I'm glad that we have a nice turnout. Basically, we've done a couple user experience talks in the past. I'm sure that some of you guys have been in attendance of those. But I kind of wanted to revisit it because I get a lot of questions about it, like how do you do this stuff? What is it? Is mainly the questions. And then, just how do I get into it? How do I start doing some of this stuff? So tonight, what I'm going to focus on is just the surface level, fundamental things. That's why it's called fundamentals. We're not going to get too deep into techniques. What I'd like to do is tackle those next month and actually do a workshop where we can get you guys sketching and card sorting and talking about user needs and things like that. So tonight is just kind of the structure of it all. For those of you who have not met me or been to a Design+Tech before, my name is Amanda Morrow. I organize Design+Tech. I try to do meetings once a month on just the fundamental things about web design and tech and things like that. Mainly geared towards designers, but I really enjoy having marketing people, writers, developers, programmers even, to kind of contribute to the conversations. I'm the interactive designer at BitMethod. This is our office. We also have a couple other startups that live here with us as well. And what I do at BitMethod is right now we're building our own product called Change, which is a cash register app for the iPad. And so I'm in charge of all the design aspects of that and the user experience. However, my team contributes to a lot of that stuff as well. Dan here's the CEO, and Neil's in the back there. We all work together to build Change. So that's a little bit about me. Fundamentals of user experience. Of course, the first question is, what is user experience? Can't start a talk about this without answering this question. So defining this, when I started putting this presentation together, I was like, oh yeah, I know exactly what this means. I'm going to wow them with my definition. And then I started looking at other people's definition, and I was like, oh, okay, this varies quite a bit from one person to another. So I know how I define it for what I do. It varies from person to person. And if you ask people who work in this area a lot, their definitions are going to be different. It's like defining design. Everyone's going to have a different definition based on what they do, what they work on, who they work with, things like that. So after being a little demoralized by my search, I decided to start with where it came from. And where it came from is this Studley fellow. Does anyone know who this is? You could probably take a guess. What? Zach Galifianakis in 30 years? Well, here, let me answer this for you. This is like the only effects I've done in this presentation, but I felt like it needed...
Is it Don Mother Effing Norman?
Yeah, his name's actually Don Norman. I just wanted to make it dramatic.
But that's his full name.
Yeah.
in the original Hebrew.
Yeah. So the reason I wanted to give this guy, some credit is because he coined the term user experience. And he's written quite a few books about design. Some of you guys are probably familiar with The Design of Everyday Things. That's one of my favorite books. But this is just a handful of the things he's written about. And he was the first one to use the term user experience. And it was back in 1996 when he worked at Apple. He was the VP of Advanced Technology Group. And basically where he used the term was, it was in a memo, a company organizational document. And he was talking about these new procedures he was trying to do for his human interface team. So he's like, we're trying out these new things. They're kind of a blend of all these other little techniques that people are doing, and we need a big term that encompasses all of this called user experience. So I thought that was really interesting. I guess I'd never really looked it up until a few weeks ago, but it comes from a software design arena. And so a lot of people tend to use user experience, and I'm one of them, to explain other things, but really the origin of it comes from software design. So that's why it's huge in the tech arena. So after doing a little more digging, I realized that he was referencing a couple products in that document about the things that they were trying these procedures on. So there were some existing things that they were trying to test some out, but there was two products that they had done their new procedures or tried their new procedures out from the beginning. And this was OpenDoc and Apple Guide. And I didn't expect the interfaces to, I don't know what I expected, but these were some of the screenshots from those products. So it gives you an idea of kind of how old this term is and, you know, when it was first mentioned. What was also interesting is I found these documents that they started putting together for these products, and they were called user experience requirements documents. If you read these documents, it's all from a user standpoint. The users are having problems with this. They're struggling with this. So here are the things we'd like to try in order to make this easier for the user, as opposed to these are the things we want to build and the features we want to build. So that's where it all kind of began. This quote I found everywhere on the internet. This is basically from an interview that I think Don Norman did, you know, maybe 10 years ago, so not quite as old as the document itself, but it's just explaining like where he got that term from, and he just needed something to explain all the different things they were doing under one umbrella. So what I found interesting is a few times I found the second part of this quote or another quote from the same interview, and it was kind of telling. It says, since then the term has spread widely, so much so that it is starting to lose its meaning. User experience, human-centered design, usability, all these things, even affordances, they sort of all entered the vocabulary and no longer have any special meaning. People use them often without having any idea why, what the word means, its origin, history, or what it's about. And this kind of answers my question about what is user experience, and I think this is why a lot of people are confused. And I think he's right. It's become a buzzword. It's one of those things like QR codes that just seem to attach onto things because people are like, well, all these other people are doing it. So we need to just throw the term user experience around and people will take us seriously. That sucks, but kind of how I approach it is, and like I said before, I know how user experience fits into the stuff I do and what I find important. But when it all boils down to it, the idea behind user experience is making things easy for your user. So no matter how you execute that, this is still important. This is the general idea, is make things easy for people. So if you walk away with anything tonight, I want you to remember this concept of like, what can you do every day to make it easier for the people using your product? And this concept's not going to go away. As we introduce more and more screens into our lives, this is going to continue to be a practice that, you know, is just going to be a no-brainer. Like, you're going to do it no matter what. So it was important back then, it's important now, and it'll be important in the future. So when people ask me, Amanda, what is your definition of user experience? I try to simplify it, and it just depends on who I'm talking about, or who I'm talking to, or what we're talking about. But I basically simplify it to good fucking design. Like, well thought out, every element has been attended to. Once you start thinking in this mode, like, it's hard to stop. You're going to start noticing bad things along with good things. But what's interesting is, I think user experience for me as a designer who was kind of trying to figure out where I fit into the world, this worked really well for me because I felt like it gave me problems to solve that were a little more concrete than just making things look pretty. It's about making things useful, you know? And so that's why I think I get, like, I'm sweating because I'm so excited to talk about this stuff. And you know, I love answering these questions, but that's where I come from. So once you start noticing good things or bad things, it's kind of hard to stop, and then it'll start creeping into the work you do. Think of your favorite restaurant. And this is probably one of those things where people are like, you throw around the word user experience too much. But restaurants, if they're done well, they have good user experience. You walk in and the decor is awesome, the atmosphere, the service is good. You know, it just kind of fits into what you're into or what you want. It's not just all about the food. It's about every little element coming together and working well with each other. So that's something to think about when you're working on your product. If something just doesn't sound right in the copy, do something about it. Like, don't just say, well, it's someone else's job. It's everyone's job. So that's my basic definition. Not a very technical one, but I hope that you guys kind of get an idea of where I'm going from here. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is just kind of how basically the process of user experience, how it fits into the process that you guys are doing now, and what you can try with some of your newer projects. So this is one of my favorite, these elements are kind of listed everywhere, but this is my favorite organization of all these elements, and I'll zoom in a little bit here. What I really like about this is everything overlaps into one another, and right in the center is UX. But there's all these other little things that contribute to that. Again, the restaurant analogy, like if this is done well, it contributes to the center. If it's done poorly, it'll, weaken the center basically. So if you don't pay attention to all these little different elements, people are going to notice. If you go to a restaurant, the meal is amazing, the service was awesome and stuff, but it took them like 45 minutes to get your check, or you get your check and you can only pay with cash and you don't have cash, that might ruin your evening. That's kind of how everything overlaps into each other for any project you do and for the elements of user experience. For our team, we're pretty small. I tend to take this area. Dan's more of the business analyst area. And then Neil kind of fits more into the green area. But it all overlaps. It's not siloed. I want to introduce you guys to another Studley fellow. This guy's Jesse James Garrett, and he wrote this book, The Elements of User Experience. And I'm just going to walk you through his outline of the user experience process and kind of all the little things that he says you should kind of pay attention to or make note of during that process. So here's his general structure. There's 5 planes. This is the design phase of the project. And the lower you are, the more abstract the things you're trying to tackle are. Ideas, brainstorming, just bits of information. And then as you go further up, your project starts to turn into a concrete thing. It starts to turn, develop into what you're trying to build. There's also this diagram in the back of this book, which kind of correlates with his, the previous diagram. But this kind of shows like the makeup of a team. Again, user experience means something different to everyone. Some people are really, really adamant that you should have a user experience professional on staff, no matter what. You're not doing user experience unless you have someone on staff who's dedicated to doing this research, doing this testing. Well, that's not going to work for everyone. For our team, there's 3 of us, so it's a responsibility of all of ours. So I'm a little more biased to that layout. But as your team grows, or if you're tackling more complex things, you might need someone to be that user experience person who keeps tabs on all these different elements and organizes them and gets everyone bought into them. That's the big thing with user experience, is getting buy-in, making sure that the development team is on the same page as the marketing team, as the support team, as the design team. So I thought this was interesting. Back to his process. I'm going to walk you guys through each of these. And like I said, I'm going to focus more on just like the things you're tackling in these phases and not so much how you do it. Techniques, vary quite a bit. Some people like using whiteboards, some people like using napkins, Post-it notes, whatever. I'm not going to talk about that stuff too much tonight. So this is how the phases, and I kind of mentioned this before with the other one, this is how the phases kind of mesh together. He really encourages everyone to be flexible, and this is, again, why it's kind of hard to define user experiences. Some of these are more fluid. They flow into the next phase. You should feel comfortable knowing that you don't have to figure everything out right at the end of phase 1. You can move on to phase 2, see what's working, jump back, fix a couple things, go for it, and it's a flexible system. Too often I see people struggling in development teams like the one up top, where it's, you have to turn this in, it goes on to the next person, you guys have to turn that in, and there's not a lot of back and forth. That's hard to do. I feel really bad for those people, and all I can tell them is, try and encourage your boss to do something more like this. All right, so strategy. I'm doing some weird graphics things here, so hopefully you guys will get this. If not, I apologize, but this is the only way I can make it sense in my head. All right, the strategy phase. This is where you just go and you collect a ton of stuff. You do a lot of research. You talk to users. You talk to clients. You talk to other people on your team. You try and just snatch up any bit of information that will help you make better design decisions later on. So The collection phase is kind of what I call it. That's the first part of it. So once you're starting to collect all this information, then you need to start parsing through it and figuring out what's actually going to work for you. Here's kind of, in his book, this is kind of the things that he outlines. Setting objectives, figuring out what your business needs are, starting conversations about branding, figuring out like how you're going to measure the success of the project you're working on. If you have users, figure out what they need, what problems you can solve for them. If you don't, you need to start developing personas of what that user looks like. And then also state of the art, figuring out what the competition's doing or what that industry is doing. These are all things that you can start tackling during this phase. So before I had all these little bits of information, you start picking out the ones you want to work with, the ones that you think are important. For the product we're working on, Change, we started testing with a coffee shop. So that's where we started. Our users were coffee shops. We tried to identify the things that they need. They really only needed basic things. They needed to be able to take an order, collect payment, and maybe manage their drawer and get a report at the end of the day. Very basic stuff. So that's where we started. And then from there, we can start figuring out what's the next thing they need. What's the next priority for them. When we started talking about who our ideal coffee shop was, we decided that we're going to try and get rid of as many of these things as possible. And basically, our strategy was we have to just outdo this thing, which is reassuring, like these things have been around for a long time. They're pretty crappy. Everyone hates them. We just need to outdo this, pace this thing. So that's what a lot of our questions were centered around is who are these people using these things? What do they need? How can we make their life better? In the next phase, you stop asking the questions of why and what and all that, and you start saying, how are we going to do this? This is when you start prioritizing what you're actually going to build. So you kind of have an idea of what you want to build. How are you going to do it? During this phase, you start figuring out technical requirements. You start figuring out what kind of content you're going to need. And then on top of that, you're going to start walking through scenarios so you can kind of get an idea of what you're missing and if you need to add it to your priorities list. One of the things that I've seen work really well with so many different teams is a method called Moscow, which basically just makes you prioritize things. It's must, should, could, would. What do we have to do? Must. We must do this in version 1. We must tackle this first. Should is we should do it if we have time. It's the next priority down. The could is kind of the icing on the cake. It's the stuff that if you can get it done, you can do it, but if you don't, no one's going to really notice. And then the would is what you want to do in the future or what you plan on doing in the future. This has really helped take very complex things and narrow them down. For us, point of sales, you can just keep brainstorming and brainstorming for days on all the things they can do. But really, you have to figure out what those fundamental things are to start with before you can start building on top of that. So this process worked really well for that. This is me organizing my bits of information here. So if you want to, you could do the Moscow, must, should, could, would. But you start categorizing things and really organizing them in a way that makes sense to you. Structure. During this one, you start to basically build that more concrete concept of what your final product's going to look like. You start grouping things, you start mapping out workflows. A lot of these start off with just boxes and arrows and maybe a couple bullet points. And then they start turning more into interfaces. So some of the things that you do during this phase are building concept maps, figuring out what all the conventions are for whatever you're building for. So if you're doing the web, what are standard things that people do? If you're doing Android, what are things that we can do with the Android device that we can't quite do with maybe an iPhone? Things like that. You start developing your language and your vocabulary. How are we going to label these things? How are we going to talk about them? What's going to make sense to our users? So you can kind of see where things are starting to become a little more concrete. This is where I start organizing my information. Before we were kind of grouping it, now we're actually walking through it and seeing how it makes sense and how it flows in the user's mind. Here's some early groupings that I did for Change. This stuff's really old, but I found it in my pile and I thought it was interesting because I started grouping on the ordering screen. What are all these things that we can do? And so I started putting them into columns and settings. What things can I throw into that area? And then seeing how you would flow through it. So these are early concept maps, basically. I do a lot of this stuff. It looks kind of crazy. But, I mean, this is basically just a concept map, but I start walking through like, okay, if I'm managing items, I want to add a new one, edit one. Okay, if I add new, what are all the different, and what I like about this is I can just keep adding branches. It helps me make sure I'm not forgetting anything, and I can focus on one thing at a time. A lot of times we'll do this as a group on a whiteboard and just say, okay, what are all the things we're forgetting, you guys? Like, let's just keep adding branches. This isn't a picture of us, but I found this on the internet, and you see a lot of this with UX design teams, of just throwing everything at a board and trying to make sense of it and make sure you don't miss anything. Or if you have a brainstorm, add it to it and see if you can tackle it somehow. This is kind of a mix of notes and doodles and workflows and post-it notes, and it looks like they have a little bit of interface design too. But again, everything's coming together and will develop into something more concrete later on. All right, on to the skeleton phase. This is where you basically start building a blueprint of what your product's going to look like. And when I say blueprint, I really mean blueprint, because a blueprint for a house does not tell you what color the paint's going to be. It doesn't tell you what brand the oven is going to be. It doesn't say what kind of carpet you're going to have. It just says, this is where everything's going to be placed. This is where you're going to find things. General measurements, you start factoring in some technical things, but it doesn't get into the little details. It's just the structure of it. So during this phase, you're going to start designing not just sketching interfaces, but you'll actually start doing wireframes for them. So you'll start doing black and white mock-ups, I guess you could say. But you're only worried about text, and you're only using boxes and grayscale things. If you start introducing branding stuff, people get really focused on that. Again, the brand of the oven. Well, I don't know if I want to buy that oven. Well, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about where the oven's placed. Are you happy with that? So this is where you start to, again, see more and more stuff coming to shape. So for this one was a stretch. I did this. So all my bits and pieces of information are starting to take shape, but they're not, and there's still the overall structure there, but they're not quite finished. They're still kind of black and white. Here's some stuff that I found today that, kind of shows this. The left side is like some sketches I did for our website, where I was just trying to work through like, okay, these are the things I want to communicate. What are the different ways I can do that? And then I cross them off as I either nix them or design them. On the right is me just working through, I think it's modifying items. I mean, it's not very coherent, but it just shows like I'm taking random notes up top. I'm trying to work through a couple different button ideas, things like that. So this is where I start tackling like basically how the actual app's going to work now that I have all my data mapped out onto certain screens. This one belongs to Neil. This is one of my favorite sketches because I was really struggling with how to handle this one interaction, and it was really, really important for our app. It's basically going into a group, picking an item, and exiting it. And it seems pretty simple, but there was a lot of different options we could do, and I just wasn't sure what the best one was and what the easiest one was going to be for development time. And Neil drew up a couple options, and I think we ended up with one of them.
Bottom right.
This one?
I'm pretty sure.
I think it's maybe a mix of these two. I don't know. But it was great because I could kind of get, like, he was brainstorming ideas and I could feed off of his ideas. I thought this was a great exercise. And I hate people who say they can't sketch because as much as Dan hated it, he will sketch and he does amazing sketches, like you just have to encourage people to do boxes and arrows, don't do anything fancy, just communicate what they're talking about. Okay, so once I kind of have some sketches figured out, and sometimes I'll do them on a whiteboard, sometimes I'll do them on paper, it just depends on the project, I'll start building out wireframes. And this is a wireframe for creating a new item within our app. So if you're adding stuff to your menu. And I did add color. I know I said don't add color, but I was just trying to highlight what we were actually focusing on that screen. Yellow is probably the only color I'll add, or I'll add a picture of me. Sometimes I do that, but because I'm lazy and don't want to draw an avatar. But this is just kind of showing the workflow, and I'll do probably depending on the interaction, I might do 15, 20 of these just to walk through a workflow. Because these are disposable, they're easy to do, but they can communicate really clearly what the app's going to look like and how it's going to work. So this is for ordering screens. This is for placing items. And within this app, you do highlight stuff, or on the screen, you do highlight things. So that's kind of where the yellow is coming from too. So this is just showing, like, if I select something from here, I can place it over here. And everyone can look at that and kind of get a general idea of what it's going to do without me spending too much time doing this. All right, the last plane in the elements of user experience is surface. So this is where you basically put on a coat of paint and you hang up the picture frame and you put those little details on before development. And this is when you start introducing branding. You start finalizing things, you start issuing uniformity throughout things. You can kind of get away with things being a little wacky in wireframes, but this is when everything needs to start being consistent. And you basically build the mock-ups that are pixel perfect for the final product, so your development team can actually start building them. This is where this turned into. So as you can see, I had the shapes from before, but now I'm adding color to them. You know, these are this is the surface level. So you can kind of see how we went from a bunch of dots into very structured, it molded into something that you were aiming for. So, you know, these wireframes turned into this. So I'll go back. For the most part, everything's in the same spot. And this isn't always the case. If you're kind of new at this stuff, my first ones, I just did lists of things and then I had to figure out how I was going to organize it on the screen later. But now I've gotten to the point where if you find something on the wireframe, it's probably going to be pretty close to the same spot. This screen changes quite a bit. The arrange button disappears. The add button, I found a better solution for it when I was doing mock-ups. So you can kind of see how things just get slightly better. And even from this, you can keep improving things. But, you know, for the most part, I had done a lot of the legwork before I got to this phase. So in his book, he ends with the surface level, which I guess he considers the end of the design phase. I kind of think the design phase continues into development and testing, which is good because, like I said, I don't like to hand off things and have it be final. Once Neil starts building out my mock-ups, there's a lot of times he'll have little things that I've totally missed. I'll think I'll have everything. He'll be like, I still need an error message for this. Or I still need some way of treating this interaction. And so as much as you try, you're probably not going to catch everything, but that's okay because you can work with your development team to come up with better solutions. And then during testing, I think this is really important too. Some people do have UX professionals who go and issue these tests and, you know, come back with feedback. As a designer, I try to do a lot of this stuff. Everyone on our team does it, really. I mean, we will walk around the office and say, hey, can you use this? And we'll try and see what trips people up. And then you go back to the drawing board. I think we ended up redoing our tills and drawer workflow 3 times. Because the first time we thought we kind of had it. The second time we tried to fix it, but it just was still too complicated. And then the third time we finally had it figured out. And I'm really glad that we went through those phases because otherwise we would have ended up with a really crappy thing, or we would have been stuck with a really crappy thing. All right, so that's basically a really general process. This isn't going to work for every project. This isn't going to work for all of you, but this is kind of some of the, if you want to get started, this is where I would start, is going through these different steps. The last part of my presentation is basically going to be what makes good UX. And again, this is a subjective thing. Things that I think are really important might not be important to you or to your users. Personally, like the Mail app on iPad, I can't stand, but a lot of people find it useful. It's a subjective thing. It just depends on your preferences. But over the years, the 2 years I've been doing this, 2.5 years, I think at this point, I've tried to relate my approach to user experience to some sort of analogy. Over the last few months, I've realized that my approach is a lot like good parenting. A good user experience designer, I think, should be like a good parent. And to help you with this, I'd like you guys to meet my parents in their wedding day in 1980. This is Brett and Kelly Morrow, and here they are today. They literally took this picture 2 hours ago. Because I was like, you guys, I don't have a picture of you together. And so they look really happy to do this, which is awesome. But yeah, so these are my parents. My parents are not overbearing. They're not neglectful. They're kind of right in the middle. And I think that worked really well for me. And so I think this has translated very well into my approach for user experience. So here are my top 5 parenting tips for UX. First one, guide them. Don't get in their way, but don't leave them hanging. You don't want to be a helicopter parent, but you also don't want to be the parent that leaves your kid at school because you forgot to pick them up. You want to be in the middle. And what I always appreciate about my parents is they would encourage me to try new things. They would, push me out into the world. And if I really needed their help, they'd jump in. Otherwise, they just let me kind of figure stuff out. And sometimes I fail still, but, it wasn't too bad. I'm hopefully not too crazy because of it. So this is kind of how I approach, or how I think is an interface should work, is you should guide your users through, help them out when they need it, but don't get in their way. I'm not a big fan of tutorials that make you go through 10 steps right when you open the app, because then I'm like exhausted by the time I get through the tutorial. However, I've noticed there's been a trend of people doing these overlays where they jump in, they kind of give you a general idea of how it works, and then you click it and it disappears. However, if you need it back, you just tap that little button up in the top corner and it comes back. So I find these kind of interesting. This is from Snapseed. I'm not saying this is the right answer for everything, but it guides you along, it gives you help when you need it, but it doesn't get in your way. And I think these usually disappear after the first few times you open the app. So it's only when you are trying something new. And that's something to keep in mind, is like your users are going to learn things. So if you decide to put permanent instructions somewhere, they're going to see that forever. But if you know that they're going to figure it out after a while, maybe find a different way of using that. My second tip for parenting, don't confuse them. Don't frustrate them. Don't make them feel stupid. How many of you guys have seen how many times you can trick a toddler by like hiding something? You can get away with it quite a few times, but then after a while, they're going to melt down and they're going to freak out, and then it's not worth it, no matter how much entertainment you got out of it. What's interesting is your users are not even going to last that long. They're going to open your app. If it's confusing or hard to use, they're going to delete it. Same thing with websites, whatever you're building. One of my favorite books to tackle this subject is Don't Make Me Think. And as you can guess, he tells designers to don't make your users think. So he really encourages to make things obvious, or leave cues in your interfaces so they can kind of figure it out, or that there's a clue that they're supposed to do something. So how many of you guys have run into a door like this? I was going to say, everyone should probably be raising their hand because I know you all have. This isn't obvious. If there's a handle, it should be pull. If there's a bar, it should be push. But what was really awesome about, doing research for this presentation is I found tons of videos on YouTube. That's probably what led to my procrastination. But people running into glass doors constantly, and it seems really obvious, but there wasn't a visual cue to tell them what to do, what way the door opened, or even that it was a door. So these are things to think about. Leave visual cues of what they're supposed to do, and don't do too much that it confuses them. Every time I use my stove, I have to think about what knob goes to what. It's not obvious, but you don't see anything mapped like this because it just isn't the standard. It's not really encouraged, and everyone's pretty used to the knobs at the top, but people struggle with that. Okay, so I've been teaching a class at Drake. I've done 3 classes so far, but on the first day I said, go out and find examples of bad user experience. And here are some of the photos that my students came back with, and they're pretty awesome. The one on the left is a door. And can you guys guess which way you open it? No, because the handles are on both sides. What's really awesome, So what's really awesome is you go to open it and the whole door falls on you. So my student said, yeah, the first time I opened it, it fell on me and I got dust everywhere. And it was just a door to like her water heater or something. But every time she's like, I don't know how to open it. And it was really confusing. The one on the right is a water dispenser at a restaurant, but they only give you paper cups. So you destroy the cup right away, and it's not very useful. These are from the same person, same house. What's really funny is, I think it was a few months ago, I got tired of my washing machine door opening the wrong way. It opened towards the dryer and I couldn't get the stuff out. And so then I looked and all I had to do was undo a couple screws. And it was like 6 o'clock in the morning. I'm just grabbing my clothes for the day. And I unscrewed that door and put it on the other side. And then I think 2 days later, Eric finally goes, "Did you do something to the door? The washing machine looks weird." And I'm like, "Yeah, I fixed it because I was tired of dealing with it." So, but I thought this was really great. And then also the sink, I think Bennett said that it only, you can't really wash anything in that sink on the left because the faucet doesn't go that far. And faucets are notorious for this stuff. So, like I said, once you start noticing these things, you're just like, why did they do that? Why are they frustrating me? Why are they confusing me? All right. Tip 3, give feedback. My dad is pretty good at telling me when I'm doing stuff wrong. He's not shy about it. "Amanda, have you watered your grass at all this summer?" And I said, "No, Dad, I rent." But he wants to make things better in my life, and he felt like I needed to water my grass. However, as a kid, some of the feedback's a little more subtle. How many times have you guys gone to reach something as a kid and you just watch your parents to see like if they're glaring at you or if they're not paying attention? You know, like you need that feedback to tell if you're doing something right or something wrong. And so sometimes it's, a little more obvious, error messages that pop up in your face. Other times it's a little more subtle. Your users need feedback just as much as kids do. A good example is this is faucets. When you turn the handle, the water starts coming out. If you turn it further, more water starts coming out. And then if you turn the other handle, the heat adjusts. This is instant feedback for you. You know if you're doing something wrong or right. This one's kind of hard to see, but you can do a lot of this stuff really subtly in the background. So for Apple, like if you're downloading something, they don't make you wait. They just have it in the background and you can, there's a visual cue that something's still going on, but it's not in your way, but you still know what's happening. So I thought that was great. For change, when we have people switch screens, especially if their screens are pretty similar, so if they have a lot of similar items on one screen to another, we need to make it very obvious that they're switching from one to the next. So we have a big number pop up and you actually can slide across the bottom and you can see the items changing in the background, but you see this number and there's feedback right there that you're doing something, that you're moving around. And then we're also making note of where your location's at by highlighting the squares at the bottom. So you can see how that feedback's helpful. And what's great about interactive design is you can really do a lot with feedback. You can make buttons feel like you're actually pushing something. Sometimes you can make devices vibrate if it's in a game or things like that. So finding ways to make it feel more real through feedback is really important. Also, are there any those times that you click on something and nothing happens, and then you click again, and then all of a sudden it clicks 3 times for you? Like, that's really frustrating. So those are those little details that you really need to be paying attention to. All right, step 4. I only have 5, so we're almost done. Set them up for success. This one's a little harder to describe. It's something that I think a lot of people don't think about. How terrible is it if you accidentally delete all the contacts in your phone? That's horrifying. Like, your phone should not let you do that. Like, it should ask you 5 times, like, are you sure you want to do this? When you bring a baby home to your house, the first thing you do is baby-proof everything. Well, maybe more when they're toddlers, when they're starting to walk around. But you want to make sure that they're not going to electrocute themselves, they're not going to fall down the stairs, they're not going to do something terrible. You need to do the same thing in the things you're building. You need to make sure that they're foolproof, that they're not going to do something chaotic. For us, if they lose their entire menu, their whole business can't function. I mean, maybe they'll have to kind of work away on it, but I mean, that's a lot of stress on somebody. So you really have to think of ways of making sure that you're setting them up for success and then also trying to get them to avoid failure. So a lot of it is just looking ahead and thinking of all the chaotic or disastrous things that could happen. This is an example from MailChimp. If you want to delete anything, they usually have you type out delete to make sure you don't accidentally click things. The other day in class, we were sketching out, I think it was audio recording apps, and one of the sketches had the clear button right next to the save button, like really, really close, like right next, they were touching each other. And I said, hey, are you concerned at all that your clear button is right next to the save button? The student goes, yes. Didn't even miss a beat. He's just like, yeah, I totally screwed up. But, realizing that stuff, that if I go to save something and accidentally clear it, that's terrible. That's a horrible thing that can happen. And it might happen multiple times. This is an emergency medical app. That's a lot of fields for someone to fill out in a very stressful situation. And they also all look alike. So these are things to think about. If you have a screen with a lot of form fields on it, make sure that if their battery dies, that they're not going to lose everything they filled out. Sometimes it's better to like break these up into separate screens. Try and walk them through some of this stuff as opposed to just barfing everything out on the screen like this. So again, setting them up for success as opposed to mistakes where they could do something terrible, especially in the medical field or anything that relies on people's lives. So the last one, I don't know if I really have to explain too much. My parents aren't robots, so I mean, to relate it back to them, like, they're pretty human. They have emotions and stuff. We tend to forget this when we're working on the things we're building. We tend to forget that we're humans interacting with other humans through technology. We're not humans interacting with technology. You see the difference there? So you have to think about how you would talk to a person and make your app or your website talk like a person. A couple weeks ago, or I think this was before Christmas, I ordered some pots and pans from Woot. And they got to me super fast. The transaction was really seamless. I was so excited that I got them early. I started opening them up and I started pulling them out. And I was like, yeah, this is awesome. I got new pots and pans. Haven't had these forever. And then I realized they were the wrong color. And I was like, darn, I ordered red and I got black. But I didn't even notice because I was so excited and I was so happy with like what had happened. But what was great is I was like, well, they're open. I want to use them. I'm going to keep them. Maybe I'll just email Woot and say, hey, you guys screwed up. Before I could even check my email the next day, they had sent me this. And it said, no, you're not suffering from a rare red and black color blindness. The KitchenAid 14-piece classic porcelain cookware set you ordered from us on Friday was supposed to be one color, and we sent you the other one. We are sorry. And then at the bottom, they say, we know none of these options are perfect. They basically gave me a couple options of like, you can send it back, we'll give you a discount, whatever. Or they said you could do nothing, so I opted out to do nothing. They said, we know none of these options are perfect. You weren't planning for this mess when you made this purchase. The mistake is all ours. We're really sorry we made it. And for some reason, I wasn't even that upset, but this made me love Woot like a million times more because they treated me like a person. They were on top of it. And like, again, everything contributes to the user experience. So as much as you can, try and think of how a human would want to interact with your website, how you're going to talk to them. If you're reading your copy out loud and you wouldn't say that to a person, hi, welcome to the best banking branch in Iowa. We're #1 in customer service. You would never say that in person, so don't say it on your website. So it's just things to keep in mind when you're designing, that you're designing for humans. You're not designing websites for robots. So that's pretty much all I have. So I will gladly take questions now if anyone has them. Neil.
So the number 2 you're talking about, like not making the user feel stupid, but making things ambiguous.
Uh-huh.
But I like when you first read that, I was thinking that you're going to talk about how sometimes you can make the user feel stupid by over-explaining everything and making them...
That's true too. So what Neil's talking about is, sometimes it's not always just leaving people hanging, but it's also treating them inappropriately, maybe for their age or their demographic, or, talking to the lowest common denominator when maybe you're dealing with very intelligent people as your user base. So you have to factor that in. What?
So which parents do all the time.
Yes, and parents do that all the time. So a good example of this is I know Hatchlings struggled with it because they're a virtual Easter egg hunt through Facebook. And they use a lot of awesome characters that, are bunnies and creatures, and it's all through Easter eggs and stuff, and it's very colorful. And at first you kind of think it's targeted towards kids, but their users are actually a lot of adults, and they love the look of their artwork. Unfortunately, when they went to go do the redesign, they started doing a lot of jokes that were very like punny and kind of like some of them worked, but some of them were very kid friendly, I guess you could say. And I know they really struggled with how adult should they act for their, and it's, again, you kind of have to test things out and see what works. But they really struggle with it, like how family friendly should we be, and how many jokes can we crack that are more adult in nature. And it's kind of, I think the example I gave them is look at Pixar. Like, they do a really good job of cracking jokes that little kids, it just kind of goes over their head. They still think it's funny, but then the adults are still laughing. And so, I mean, there's people that have done some of that stuff successfully. You just kind of have to go see how they've done it. But I thought that was a great point. Yep. Anyone else have questions?
That's actually one thing I've found with a lot of this stuff, doing mock-ups and all that, is it's really easy to get into it with somebody about, well, it needs to be like this, or it needs to be like this. And even if you've done it a certain way in the past, the only way to really get an answer is to try it on somebody.
Yeah.
Actually, not just on somebody, but really kind of your target audience.
Yep. And it's really easy to sit at your desk, you know, and like sometimes you just have to get up and go like talk to random people and try things out and find a way to do that. So sometimes prototyping works for an instance like that, where you need to just get it kind of working in the way that you're intending. I know for the till stuff that I was talking about earlier, there's an app on the iPad called App Cooker, and I can actually make a prototype and click through. And I actually did it in that because I wasn't able to figure it out any other way. And I was able to have Dan walk through, and I said, open a drawer. Okay, now name your till. Okay, now balance that till, you know, things like that, and really test it out. And that's the thing. There's no right answer for any of this stuff. It just depends on the project. I don't do that for a lot of my other things, but for that particular instance, I had to. Is there anybody else that is doing some of this stuff that, you know, some tips that have worked really well for you? Sure.
I know I'm on the testing side,
Uh-huh.
so I'm the person that's trying to break it.
Mm-hmm.
So I know I try to be as honest as I can to the developers
Okay.
and say, I need this decimal point over here because government says we can only do truncations of blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
But they won't know because they're looking at the design and development of it, not the actual process that I need to have.
Do you ever feel like you get friction on some of that stuff, or?
There has been some, but I've just started, so
Okay.
I'm hearing like horror stories from the past.
Okay. That's interesting. Thank you. All right. Anything else? Okay. Thanks again for coming, guys. Feel free to hang out. We still have some beer, I think, in the back. If you guys have any questions for me, I'm going to stick around for a little bit. Like I said, next month, I think we're going to try and do a workshop on a lot of this stuff. So we'll probably sit down, maybe concept through a couple app ideas or a website, things like that. If you do a lot of this stuff, please come, because I can always use other people who have experience in this helping other people out. But other than that, thanks again for coming.